Welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly pumped and honestly deeply humbled to guide you through today's topic. Because, well, we're diving into a truly monumental historical document. We're talking about a text that literally shook the world and completely altered the course of the 20th century. Today, we're exploring the abridged edition of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's staggering masterwork, the Gulag Archipelago. This isn't just a book. It's an exhaustively researched experiment in literary investigation that ripped the lid off a hidden world of secret police, transit centers, and forced labor camps. We're going to unpack the terrifying mechanics of exactly how this system operated, and more importantly, dive into the profound moral questions it forces us to ask about human nature itself. So let's get right into it. Okay, to kick things off, let's look at Solzhenitsyn's famous Nobel Prize quote, which I think immediately establishes the massive moral stakes of what we're talking about today. One word of truth shall outweigh the whole world. I mean, just think about the context here. Solzhenitsyn wrote this massive, sweeping document in absolute secret, mostly at night. He was constantly smuggling parts of it out to the West, living under the constant threat of the secret police. He even survived a poisoning attempt. So he wasn't just casually writing history, right? He was actively engaging in a battle against what he saw as a supreme lie. And this quote, it really tells us everything about his core mission. He believed that merely documenting the truth of the camps, just bringing the sheer, unvarnished facts into the light of day, possessed enough power to actually topple an empire. Now, the scope of this abridged edition is just massive. Today, we're going to journey from the macro level, the sweeping historical ideology that built this system, right down to the absolute micro level, which is the sheer human terror of a single individual arrest. Solzhenitsyn didn't just guess at this stuff. He based this work on the secret testimony of over 200 survivors, plus his own 11 years of harrowing experience in the labor camps and in exile. It's a vast canvas, for sure, but to truly wrap our heads around it, we have to see how these grand political theories actually materialized in the living rooms and the stairwells of everyday citizens. But before we step into those living rooms, we really have to confront this number, 60 million. That is just staggering. Solzhenitsyn establishes this estimated death toll to really drive home the immense gravity of our subject. This wasn't just some localized tragedy, it was a systemic catastrophe. To put that into perspective, when the Gulag Archipelago was finally published and burst into the intellectual world, it sold over 30 million copies across 35 languages. But way more important than the sales was how it fundamentally delegitimized the entire Soviet system in the eyes of the global public. It made it absolutely impossible to ignore the scale of the devastation. It literally transformed the word gulag from a dry bureaucratic acronym into a universal synonym for modern man's inhumanity to man. So how is that death toll even reached? Well, to understand that, the foreword to the text argues that these atrocities were not just some accidental corruption of good intentions, but actually a direct result of Marxist doctrines regarding class guilt. According to this analysis, the doctrine categorized human beings entirely by their economic class or their group identity, which completely wiped out the whole concept of individual guilt or personal responsibility. In this kind of framework, you didn't even need to commit a specific crime to be condemned. Your guilt was just assumed simply by belonging to the wrong historical class. The text posits that this exact shift, moving from individual innocence to collective class guilt, was the philosophical engine that drove the entire terror. And here is where things get incredibly dangerous. Because when guilt is based purely on group identity, rather than what an individual actually does, the definition of the oppressor just endlessly expands. It didn't stop with the political elite, not at all. The text notes how the devouring net expanded rapidly to catch students, religious believers, socialists, and successful peasant farmers, who were known as kulaks. It makes sense, right? When a system operates on class guilt, the line of who is an enemy keeps moving until practically everyone is targeted. It becomes this relentless machine that requires a constant supply of victims, leading to a society where literally everyone is at risk of being completely erased by an ever-expanding definition of who is a threat. Let's move over to Chapter 1 and see how this builds. We're going to pivot from that broad historical and ideological overview right down to the desperate, agonizing question asked by almost every single arrested individual. Me? What for? Solzhenitsyn points out that because so many of the people being swept up in this expanding net were genuinely innocent of any actual crime, this was their immediate, totally unanswerable response. They just couldn't fathom why they were being taken. This simple, three-word question perfectly captures the total absurdity and the blinding shock of the system descending upon a completely unprepared, ordinary citizen.
I want you to imagine, just for a second, the visceral terror of a sudden, sharp ring at your door in the middle of the night. Solzhenitsyn describes arrest as a bolt of lightning. Actually, no, he calls it a spiritual earthquake. It's this blinding flash that shifts your present life instantly into the past. Imagine rude jackboots stepping into your home, emptying your wardrobes onto the floor, completely pulling your life apart while you just stand there in your pajamas. Every single one of us feels like the center of our own universe, right? Well, in that split second, your universe is entirely shattered. You are pulled through a disguised gate in the fabric of society, and the door to your past life just slams shut behind you forever.
But here's what's truly chilling. This wasn't random chaos. The secret police actually turned terror into a highly organized clinical procedure. Solzhenitsyn breaks down what he calls the science of arrest. First, it started with quotas, broad assignments dictating exactly how many people needed to be brought in from a specific town or even a specific factory floor. Next came the element of surprise, ensuring the target was caught completely off guard, totally unable to hide or destroy any papers. And finally, the execution with overwhelming force. They'd often send multiple armed agents in the dead of night to arrest a single bewildered person who hasn't even had time to button their trousers. It was terrifyingly efficient.
And what makes this science even crazier is how bizarrely theatrical it became. Now, the traditional, terrifying nighttime raid was definitely a favorite, mostly because it kept the neighbors in the dark and the victim groggy. But the daytime arrests, those were shockingly theatrical. The text details people being arrested in normal factory corridors or being enthusiastically embraced by a fake friend in a crowded train station, just so they could quietly whisk them away. Solzhenitsyn even documents a man who was arrested by a bicyclist who casually ran into him on the street. Oh, and get this. A school inspector who was literally dragged away while in the middle of stomach surgery on the operating table. No way, right? The theatricality was endless, turning everyday normal life into a landscape of hidden traps. Now, this brings us to one of the most haunting questions Solzhenitsyn wrestles with in the whole book. Why did millions of people fail to resist? Why didn't they scream or fight back or run when they were being taken? He writes, "A submissive sheep is a find for a wolf." He explains that this paralysis actually stemmed from a universal belief in their own innocence. Because they knew for a fact they were innocent, they assumed it was just a massive bureaucratic mistake. They thought, if I resist, I'm only going to make my situation worse. They'll figure it out and let me go. This desperate hope, combined with the sheer shock of the moment, caused millions of people to simply walk down the stairs on tiptoe, exactly as they were ordered, just so they wouldn't wake their neighbors.
So where did all that psychological submission ultimately lead? The physical destination was what Solzhenitsyn calls the Gulag Archipelago. It was a vast, almost invisible chain of islands, or destructive labor camps, scattered all across the entire continent of the Soviet Union. Millions of people who were silently cooperating with their own arrests out of shock and this completely false hope of justice were just swallowed up by this sprawling geographic patchwork of prisons and forced labor. They basically disappeared from society as if they had never existed in the first place. But remember, Solzhenitsyn wasn't just a historian writing about this process from afar. He was a victim of it. He recounts this incredibly intimate and frankly surreal anecdote of his own arrest at the military front and his subsequent transport through Moscow. Just picture this. He's being escorted by counterintelligence officers who don't even know their way around the city. They end up walking right through a brilliantly lit Moscow subway station. Solzhenitsyn is riding the escalator down, surrounded by hundreds of completely oblivious, completely free Muscovites riding up. He is literally crossing the threshold into the underworld, standing mere inches away from normal society. And yet, he remains entirely silent. He doesn't shout. He doesn't warn a single soul.
So why didn't he cry out? Why didn't he warn the crowd while he had the chance? Well, the text provides this incredibly moving explanation. He says that the few hundred people in that subway station were simply too few. He writes, "Vaguely, unclearly, I had a vision that someday I would cry out to the 200 million. In that moment of profound isolation and silence, he was already germinating the seed of this exact book. He kept his silence on that escalator so that he could survive to document the entire system, to write a text so undeniable and so powerful that it would reveal the hidden truth of the archipelago to the entire nation and ultimately to the rest of the world." And that brings us to the ultimate moral takeaway of the text. Solzhenitsyn insists that if you read this book merely as a political exposé, you should honestly just slam its cover shut. His primary concern is deeply moral. He writes, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." This brilliantly illustrates the argument that evil isn't a political class. It's not a specific group of people that you can just eradicate to somehow create a utopia. The capacity for profound evil and for incredible good exists as a choice within the heart of every single person. The system he survived thrived exactly because it ignored this universal human truth. Which leaves us with a final, vital question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer today. If the line dividing good and evil isn't drawn between political parties or economic classes or national borders, where is the line drawn in your own heart? Solzhenitsyn's monumental work really challenges us to look inward, to recognize our own capacity for both submission and for courage. I highly encourage you to go explore the source material further to discover the incredible resilience of the human spirit that he documents. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today, and as always, keep asking the big questions.